What if the past is not as silent as we imagine? What if, beneath the dust of collapsed temples and the darkness of abandoned mines, history has been leaving us small, stubborn contradictions? Not grand declarations, not perfect answers, just objects. A sealed jar, a corroded machine, a sphere cut with impossible lines, things that do not quite belong to the age that made them, and because they do not belong, they disturb us. We like to think of human history as a clean ascent. One century hands its tools to the next. Knowledge grows, progress advances. The world becomes more legible with time. But the deeper we dig, the more that elegant story begins to fray at the edges. In forgotten storerooms and buried strata, there are artifacts that seem to whisper a different version of our journey, a version shaped not only by invention, but by loss, not only by discovery, but by forgetting. Some of these objects are easy to dismiss at first glance. A jar that resembles a battery, a mechanism too complex for its age, stones drilled with a precision that feels strangely modern. Yet the unease they create does not come from fantasy. It comes from their physical presence. They can be weighed, measured, tested. They exist whether we are comfortable with them or not. And perhaps that is what makes them so compelling. They do not force us to abandon reason. They ask something more difficult. They ask us to widen it, to consider that the human story may not be a straight road, but a landscape of vanished peaks, broken bridges, and knowledge lost in the long weather of time. So this is not a search for sensational answers. It is a quieter journey than that. A journey into the places where certainty softens, where memory fails, and where a single object can make the past feel suddenly unfinished. Because sometimes the most haunting discoveries are not the ones that reveal what we know, but the ones that remind us how much may have been forgotten. What if one of the oldest mysteries of electricity was buried not in a laboratory, but in the soil of ancient Mesopotamia? The object is modest, almost forgettable at first glance. A small clay jar, weathered for centuries, with a copper cylinder fitted inside, and an iron rod at its center. No polished grandeur, no ornate inscription announcing its purpose. And yet, when modern eyes first examined it, the question arrived almost immediately. Was this simple vessel capable of producing a charge? The artifact became known as the Baghdad Battery, though its true story remains uncertain. Discovered near the ancient world of Parthian and Sasanian influence, it seemed to carry the rough anatomy of something unexpectedly familiar. Add an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, and the arrangement can generate a small electrical current. That fact alone was enough to stir imaginations across the modern world. Had ancient craftspeople discovered a practical form of electricity long before the age of wires, power stations, and light bulbs? The answer, at least for now, remains suspended between possibility and restraint. Some researchers suggest the jar may have been used for electroplating, perhaps coating small objects in a thin layer of precious metal. Others argue for more ordinary explanations, such as storage, ritual use, or a function we have not yet learned to name. The problem is not that the object refuses interpretation, it is that it permits too many. And that may be the deeper lesson. We often assume that invention arrives only when history is ready to remember it. But human curiosity has never moved in perfect sequence. People experiment. They improvise. They stumble upon forces they cannot fully explain. Sometimes they build tools whose meanings vanish, while the object itself survives. So the jar sits before us like a quiet challenge. Not proof of a forgotten electric age, but evidence that the past was rarely as simple as we prefer. And perhaps That is enough, because even the possibility that ancient hands touched an unseen current reminds us that wonder is older than modern science, and that the first sparks of understanding may have flashed long before we learned how to keep the light. How could a machine, built by ancient hands, know the language of the sky? For centuries, the sea kept its answer. Then, in the early years of the 20th century, divers searching the wreck of a Roman ship near the Greek island of Antikythera brought up fragments of bronze so corroded they seemed little more than debris. At first, they looked like the ruined remains of statues or ship fittings. But inside the green decay, hidden like a thought trapped in metal, were gears. What emerged from those fragments would change the way we imagine the ancient world. The Antikythera Mechanism, now understood as a remarkably sophisticated device, was built to track celestial cycles with astonishing precision. It could model the motions of the sun and moon, predict eclipses, and follow complex calendars that linked astronomy to ritual, agriculture, and civic life. This was not a symbolic object. It was a working instrument, an analog computer fashioned nearly 2,000 years ago. Its existence unsettles more than our sense of chronology. It reveals that technical brilliance does not always survive the civilizations that create it. Here was a machine whose craftsmanship would not be matched again for many centuries, not because humanity had lost the capacity for intelligence, but because knowledge can be fragile. Workshops vanish, empires fall, teachers die without students, libraries burn, and what once seemed ordinary in one age can appear miraculous in another simply because the chain of memory has broken. There is something moving about that idea. We tend to treat history as a vault where achievements are safely stored, but it is closer to a shoreline. Each generation tries to hold what it can, while the tide keeps pulling pieces away. The Antikythera Mechanism is one of those pieces returned to us, water-worn but intact enough to remind us that the past contained minds every bit as restless and exacting as our own. So when we look at its gears, we are not just looking at a machine. We are looking at evidence that human genius is not rare, only vulnerable. And the question it leaves behind is as haunting as the object itself. How many other marvels were once common knowledge, only to vanish so completely that their survival now feels impossible? What if the Earth itself were keeping a secret in its seams? In a South African mine, deep in rock formations said to be billions of years old, workers uncovered small, metallic spheres unlike anything they expected to find. They were smooth, compact, and marked, in some cases, by fine parallel grooves running around their circumference. They did not look ceremonial. They did not look accidental. They looked deliberate, and that single impression was enough to ignite a storm of speculation. These objects became known as the Klerksdorp Spheres. To some, they seemed like impossible artifacts, evidence that something shaped with intention had appeared in a layer of stone far older than human civilization. The claim was irresistible because it touched a deep nerve in the modern imagination, the hope that history contains a hidden rupture, a clue that our timeline is incomplete. But geology, patient and unsentimental, offered a quieter interpretation. Many researchers concluded that the spheres were likely natural concretions, mineral formations created over immense stretches of time through processes that can produce startling symmetry. And yet the mystery does not fully disappear just because a natural explanation exists. Nature has always been more inventive than we expect. Again and again, the planet produces forms that resemble craft, design, even intelligence. Crystals grow in strict geometry. Stones fracture into patterns that look carved. Caverns resemble cathedrals no human hand ever built. Our minds are tuned to recognize order, and that gift can also mislead us. We see intention because intention is how we survive. We search for makers because we ourselves are makers. The spheres, then, become more than a question of origin. They become a mirror. They reveal how quickly wonder and certainty confuse, how easily mystery invites narrative. We do not simply discover strange objects. We surround them with our longing for meaning. We ask them to confirm that the world is deeper, older, more astonishing than we had been told. Perhaps that longing is not a weakness. Perhaps it is part of what drives inquiry forward. But it carries a responsibility. To be faithful to mystery, we must let the evidence speak before imagination takes control. And maybe that is the real power of these silent spheres. Not that they prove the impossible, but that they remind us how thin the line can be between observation and desire, between what the world is and what we ache for it to reveal. What if a single footprint could unsettle the confidence of an entire age? In the late 19th century, a slab of limestone discovered in Nevada drew attention for a shape pressed into its surface, the outline of a human shoe, complete with what seemed to be a heel. The rock was said to be ancient beyond any human timeline then accepted. If the impression were genuine, it would not merely complicate history, it would shatter it. The object became one of those anomalies that thrive in the space between evidence and appetite. To believers in lost epochs and forgotten worlds, it looked like a message from a buried civilization, a sign that human presence had reached far deeper into time than textbooks allowed. But geology and paleontology are not easily overturned by a single startling image. Many scientists argued that the so-called shoe print could be explained by natural fracture patterns, erosion, or coincidental shapes in stone that only resemble something familiar when viewed through the lens of expectation. That tension is an old one. The human brain is a master of recognition. It can find faces in clouds, figures in shadows, order in chaos. This ability has helped us survive, connect, and create meaning, but it also makes us vulnerable to illusion. When we encounter a strange mark in rock, we do not see it as blank matter. We compare it, measure it against memory, and sometimes complete the picture before the evidence has finished speaking. Still, there is something enduring about the power of an imprint. A footprint, real or imagined, feels intimate. It suggests presence, weight, a moment when a living being touched the earth and left a trace of its passing. That is why such objects captivate us. They collapse time. They make the distant feel personal. In the end, the Nevada imprint may tell us less about prehistoric shoes than about the fragile dialogue between perception and proof. We want the past to surprise us, to reveal that history is larger and stranger than we thought. And sometimes it is. But the deeper challenge is learning how to remain open without surrendering judgment. Because the marks that matter most are not always the ones that confirm our fantasies. Sometimes they are the ones that teach us how carefully we must look before we decide what exactly has been left behind. What if the oldest map of the world was not drawn only with coastlines, but with memory, rumor, and the stubborn imagination of explorers? In 1929, in a palace library in Istanbul, scholars examining old manuscripts found a fragment of a 16th century Ottoman map made by the Admiral Piri Reis. At first, it seemed like a valuable but ordinary relic of maritime history. Then, people looked closer. The surviving piece appeared to show not only parts of Europe, Africa, and South America, but perhaps coastlines that some believed should not have been known in such detail at that time. The fascination grew because the map seemed to exist at the edge of explanation. Piri Reis himself wrote that he had compiled it from many earlier sources, including ancient charts and more recent voyages. That detail opened a door wide enough for countless interpretations. Some saw the map as evidence of a lost tradition of global knowledge, preserved in fragments and copied across centuries. Others approached it more carefully, noting that old maps often combined precise observation with guesswork, inherited errors, and the imaginative filling in of unknown spaces. That is what makes the map so revealing. It belongs to an age when the world was both expanding and uncertain. Sailors crossed oceans with courage, but not with perfect data. Cartographers worked like translators between experience and mystery. They gathered stories from storms, coastlines from memory, distances from dead reckoning, and rumors from men who had seen one horizon and guessed at the next. A map, in that sense, was never just geography. It was a portrait of human confidence meeting the limits of what could be known. And perhaps that is why the Piri Reis map still grips us. Not because it proves some forgotten mastery beyond question, but because it captures a moment when knowledge itself was fluid. Land and legend lived side by side. Accuracy and uncertainty shared the same page. So the mystery is larger than one chart. It is about how human beings assemble a world before they fully understand it. Every age draws its own map of reality, confident in some lines and uncertain in others. The question is not whether our ancestors knew everything. It is whether we are humble enough to admit that our own maps, too, may someday look incomplete to those who come after us. What if one of the strangest messages from antiquity arrived not as a scroll or monument, but as a machine left at the bottom of the sea? The story begins again, with bronze, salt, and silence. For a long time, historians imagined ancient technology as brilliant but limited, ingenious in architecture and mathematics, yet still far from the dense, mechanical thinking of later centuries. Then, the Antikythera fragments were studied more deeply, and the old assumptions began to loosen. Inside those corroded plates and broken gears was a kind of thinking that feels uncannily modern. This was not merely craftsmanship, it was abstraction made physical. The heavens were translated into ratios, rotations, and predictive cycles, then compressed into a handheld device. To build such an instrument required more than metalworking skill. It required a culture capable of linking observation, theory, and precision, then trusting that the invisible order of the cosmos could be modeled in matter. That realization changes the emotional texture of the ancient world. It reminds us that intelligence does not belong to one era. The people who made this device looked up at the same moon we know, watched the same eclipses darken the same sky, and refused to let wonder remain vague. They wanted patterns. They wanted prediction. They wanted a mechanism that could hold time in its turning parts. In that sense, the object is not alien at all. It is deeply human, but it also carries a sadness. If such knowledge existed, why did it not continue openly and uninterrupted? Why do so many achievements appear in fragments, as if history advances by breakthroughs and amnesia rather than by steady accumulation? The answer may lie not in failure of intellect, but in the fragility of institutions. Knowledge needs caretakers. It needs transmission, stability, and community. Without those, even genius can become debris. So the machine asks more of us than admiration. It asks us to remember that civilization is not only built by discovery, but preserved by continuity. Ideas survive when people protect them, teach them, and make room for them to live beyond a single generation. And perhaps that is why the mechanism feels so haunting even now. Because in its broken gears, we can hear both the brilliance of the past and the warning that brilliance alone is never enough. What if the most unsettling artifacts are not the ones that prove an impossible past, but the ones that show how often human knowledge disappears? Again and again, these objects force us toward the same quiet realization. History is not a vault with every treasure neatly preserved. It is more like a field after a storm, scattered with fragments, some intact, many broken, and most already lost. We inherit not the full record of human experience, but whatever time, accident, and survival have allowed to remain. That idea becomes especially powerful when we think about tools and techniques that seem to arrive too early. A delicate mechanism, a precise carving, a material worked in ways that appear strangely advanced. The temptation is to imagine hidden civilizations or secret lineages of forbidden knowledge. Sometimes those stories are appealing because they flatter our appetite for drama, but a simpler truth may be even more profound. Human beings have always been capable of flashes of brilliance, and brilliance does not guarantee permanence. A workshop can vanish in a fire. A craft can die with a master artisan. A language can collapse with an empire. Even in the modern world, we know how fragile memory can be. Data fails. Records are erased. Libraries decay. Expertise narrows into specializations so fine that one field may barely understand another. If that is true now, in an age obsessed with preservation, how much easier was it for ancient insight to slip beneath the surface of time? So perhaps the wrong question is whether these objects should exist. Perhaps the deeper question is why we expect the past to be simpler than the present. We know that intelligence is unevenly distributed, that discovery is often accidental, and that societies do not move in perfect unison. Why, then, should history unfold in a straight line? The artifacts gathered in this story are not just curiosities. They are reminders that civilization is both inventive and fragile. They ask us to hold two ideas at once: that evidence must guide us carefully, and that human possibility has always been wider than our timelines suggest. Somewhere between skepticism and awe, we begin to approach a more honest vision of the past. Not a world of easy certainty, but one filled with brilliance, loss, and the long echo of forgotten hands. What if some of history's strangest objects endure because they sit precisely where certainty begins to fail? Not fully explained, not fully disproven, they remain in that narrow corridor between science and story. And it is there, in that uncertain light, that they gain their unusual power. A mysterious artifact does more than raise a question about chronology. It exposes the tension between what we know, what we infer, and what we desperately want to believe. That tension is not a flaw in the human search for truth. It is part of the search itself. Every field of inquiry begins with anomalies, with details that resist the current model. Sometimes those anomalies lead to revision and discovery. Just as often, they dissolve under closer examination, revealing natural causes, misread contexts, or simple human error. But even then, they have served a purpose. They have forced us to look again, to test assumptions, to sharpen the boundary between speculation and evidence. There is something almost tender in that process, We often speak of reason as if it were cold, but in its best form, it is an act of care. It refuses to humiliate mystery or worship it blindly. It listens, it measures, it returns to the object with patience. A jar, a sphere, a footprint, a machine, a map, each one asks to be seen as it is, not merely as a vessel for our ambitions. The past deserves that kind of attention, because it cannot correct us once we begin projecting ourselves onto it. And yet imagination has its place as well. Without imagination, no one would ask the daring question in the first place. No one would wonder whether a broken fragment might once have turned like a clock, or whether a forgotten technique lay hidden inside a humble artifact. Curiosity opens the door. Discipline decides what may pass through. Perhaps that balance is the real inheritance these objects offer. They teach us that wonder and restraint are not enemies. They belong together. To understand the past, we need both the courage to be surprised and the humility to accept when surprise leads not to revelation, but to a deeper, more complicated form of not knowing. And maybe that, too, is a kind of wisdom history has been trying to hand us all along. What if the deepest mystery is not hidden in the artifacts themselves, but in the pattern they form together? Seen one by one, each object invites its own explanation. A battery, perhaps. A map assembled from older sources. A machine too advanced for the age that carried it. Natural formations mistaken for design. Marks in stone that may be less than they seem. But taken together, they reveal something larger than any single case. They reveal how fragile our confidence becomes when the past refuses to stay neatly arranged. We are taught to imagine history as settled ground, a landscape already surveyed. Dates are assigned, eras are labeled. Progress moves in sequence, as though human understanding rose like a staircase from darkness into light. Yet these objects interrupt that story, not always by overturning it, but by complicating it. They remind us that history is built from surviving evidence, and surviving evidence is never complete. What we call certainty is often just the most coherent story assembled from partial remains. That does not mean every anomaly rewrites the human timeline. Most do not. Some are misidentified. Some are exaggerated. Some dissolve under better tools and more careful methods. But the existence of error does not erase the existence of gaps. There are missing chapters everywhere. Civilizations vanish. Records burn. Materials decay. Entire traditions can disappear, not because they lacked value, but because they depended on circumstances too fragile to last. This is why these impossible objects continue to matter, even when their mysteries shrink under scrutiny. They point beyond themselves. They remind us that the human record is not a perfect archive, but a wounded memory. We inherit fragments and ask them to stand in for whole worlds. Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot, and sometimes a single fragment contains just enough strangeness to make us aware of all that is absent. So perhaps the most honest response is neither belief nor dismissal, but attentiveness, to let each object speak in its own scale, to resist easy wonder and also easy contempt. Because once we accept how incomplete the record truly is, the past becomes something more intimate than a museum of finished facts. It becomes a conversation still underway, and we are not its masters. We are only its latest listeners. What if the real story behind these objects is not about impossible technology, but about the recurring humility of being human? Every age believes, at least for a while, that it has reached a clear vantage point. We organize the past into clean narratives. We name periods, sort inventions, and place ourselves at the far end of a meaningful arc. Then an artifact emerges from the ground or from the sea or from a forgotten archive, and that confidence flickers. The story still holds, perhaps, but not as tightly as before. There is something profoundly human in that moment of interruption. It reminds us that knowledge is never only accumulated, it is revised, corrected, expanded by discomfort. A puzzling object can act like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through disciplines that thought they understood their boundaries. Historians reconsider trade routes. Archaeologists revisit assumptions about craftsmanship. Scientists test what once seemed implausible. Even when the final answer turns out to be ordinary, the process leaves us changed. We have learned, at the very least, to be less careless with certainty. And maybe that is why these artifacts continue to live in public imagination. They speak to a quiet intuition many people already carry, that the world is older, stranger, and less fully mapped than modern life often allows us to feel. We move through systems built on speed and conclusion, yet these objects ask us to pause inside ambiguity. They offer no easy lesson. They do not resolve into a slogan. They simply remain, asking whether our hunger for explanation can coexist with patience. That question matters beyond archaeology. It reaches into every human effort to understand reality. How often do we mistake the limits of our evidence for the limits of what has existed? How often do we confuse what survived with what was possible? The distance between those two things may be larger than we want to admit. So the artifacts endure as more than relics. They become teachers of intellectual modesty. They remind us that mystery is not the enemy of understanding, but one of its oldest companions. And perhaps wisdom begins there, not in claiming that the past has been solved, but in recognizing that every generation inherits both knowledge and silence, and must learn how to listen to each with equal care. What if the most revealing thing about these objects is how they change the people who encounter them? A strange artifact begins as matter: clay, bronze, stone, metal, corrosion, weight. But the moment it is lifted into light, it becomes something else as well. A question, a provocation, a test of method, imagination, and restraint. It gathers experts and dreamers into the same orbit, asking each of them, in very different ways, what kind of truth they are prepared to accept. This is where the story turns inward, because the artifacts do not only challenge history, they challenge us. They expose the habits of mind we bring to every mystery. Some of us want revelation at any cost. Others want certainty so badly that they dismiss surprise before it has been examined. Between those impulses lies a more difficult discipline: to remain open without becoming gullible, skeptical without becoming closed. That balance is not easy. It asks for patience, and patience is one of the rarest virtues in any age. In that sense, these discoveries belong to a much older human tradition. Since the beginning, we have lived among signs we do not fully understand. The stars moved before astronomy named them. Illness existed before medicine explained it. Oceans were crossed before maps could truly contain them. Human beings have always had to interpret the world before fully comprehending it. Sometimes we guessed wisely. Sometimes we mistook our own longing for evidence. Most often, we did both at once. That is why these impossible objects feel so intimate. They are not just puzzles from distant centuries. They are reflections of the timeless encounter between mystery and meaning. Every generation meets that encounter in its own language, with its own tools and with its own blindnesses. We are no different. So perhaps the value of these artifacts is not that they hand us final answers, but that they refine the kind of attention we bring to unanswered questions. They teach us to look closely, think carefully, and admit the scale of what we do not know. And in a world crowded with noise and certainty, that may be one of the most enduring forms of wisdom the past can still offer. What if the oldest lesson hidden in these objects is that human beings are always standing on the edge of forgetting? We like to imagine that once knowledge is gained, it remains safely in the world, ready to be passed forward like a torch. But history tells a harsher story. Ideas disappear, skills vanish. Entire ways of seeing are swallowed by war, neglect, migration, disaster, and time. What survives is often only a shard, and from that shard, we try to reconstruct the fire that once burned around it. Seen in that light, the artifacts of the wrong time period are not simply curiosities. They are witnesses to interruption, a jar that hints at experimentation, a mechanism that compresses the heavens into bronze, a map drawn from sources already old when ink met parchment. Even the doubtful objects, the disputed stones and ambiguous impressions participate in the same larger truth, that the past is incomplete not because people were simple, but because memory is fragile. Civilization remembers unevenly. There is something almost elegiac in that realization. It means that many of the lost achievements of humanity may never return to us in full. We may find traces without context, results without instructions, beauty without the names of those who made it. The anonymous brilliance of the past surrounds us more often than we know. A road whose builders are forgotten. A formula preserved without the voice that first spoke it. A device retrieved in fragments, leaving us to imagine the workshop where it once made perfect sense. And yet, this is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of continuity. Because every time we recover one of these remnants, however partial, we participate in an ancient act of remembrance. We become part of the chain that refuses to let wonder die completely. We study, we argue, we test. We tell the story again, more carefully than before. Perhaps that is what binds us to those vanished makers across centuries. Not certainty, but effort, the desire to understand, to preserve, to leave behind something more durable than our own brief lives. And the question that follows is simple, though it lingers long after the objects are gone from view. Of all we are building now, what will endure, and what future hands will have to guess about us from the fragments we leave behind? What if the final truth these objects offer is not about the past alone, but about our relationship to time itself? We began with Anomalies, a jar that seemed to hold a spark before electricity had a name, a machine that tracked the heavens with impossible elegance, maps and marks, and metal forms that did not fit comfortably into the timelines we had inherited. Some of them remain unresolved. Some have been softened by evidence into more ordinary explanations. But together, they leave behind something more lasting than any single mystery. They leave a change in perspective. The past we come to see is not a closed room. It is a living landscape of fragments, silences, revisions, and return. Each generation enters that landscape believing it has clearer vision than the last, and each generation discovers, sooner or later, how partial that vision still is. This is not a failure of knowledge. It is the condition of knowledge. We understand by degrees. We remember in pieces. We build narratives across gaps and hope they are sturdy enough to carry meaning. And yet there is dignity in that effort, perhaps even beauty, because the search itself reveals something essential about us. We are creatures who cannot leave mystery alone. We turn over stones, we dive into wrecks, we lift corroded bronze from the sea and ask what kind of mind once shaped it. We do this not merely to conquer uncertainty, but to remain connected to those who came before us. Every artifact, whether fully explained or stubbornly obscure, is a form of contact, a signal across distance, a reminder that other people once stood beneath unfamiliar skies and asked the same enduring question: what does this world mean? That may be the most human thread of all. Not mastery, but continuity. Not perfect answers, but the willingness to keep listening. The objects found in the wrong time period do not demand that we abandon reason or surrender to myth. They ask for something subtler and more difficult: humility, attention, wonder disciplined by care. And so the story ends where all honest inquiry ends, not with certainty, but with a deeper form of reverence, for memory, for evidence, for the vanished hands that made, carried, and lost these things, and for the fragile future in which we, too, will become a mystery, waiting for someone else to piece together our meaning from what remains.